The Red Death storyline, aka the first 5 episodes of The Flash Season 9 titled Rogue War, has officially come to an end. So that being said, let's talk about the goods and bads of this entire graphic novel. Is this graphic novel a success or a failure? Let's talk about all of this. So, in my opinion, this season has not been off to a very good start at all. For me, they took some very big risks in this storyline, which they certainly shouldn't have, since this is the last season. And because of this being its last season, these risks became even worse. It made it even worse and caused more problems. Now, despite some good moments in which we will talk about in more detail in just a second, this felt like they took everything that worked from The Flash Season 8, scrapped it all up, and went back to the Season 7 approach. This not only being a very repetitive storyline which has some similarities, but also like the structure of how they like built up the storyline was very similar as well. In which, for those who regularly do watch my videos, you guys would know that I consider The Flash Season 7 the worst season of the show ever. Now, the start of this storyline right off the bat took a very huge risk tonally, with it having more of like a rom-com vibe, this obviously adding a lot of cheesiness and cringe to it, which yes, The Flash did have before, like in Season 7, in Season 5, Season 4, it did have these cringy and, kind of cheesy stuff. But this episode had a lot of it, and it was way too much for me. Now, obviously, this episode was heavily centered around Barry and Iris, and it was more of a rom-com thing, which, as I said, it is a big risk that they took. But for me, West Allen was hands down the best thing that came out of this, not only this first episode, but the entire storyline as well. I did really like the idea of Barry and Iris having to work together and overcome this conflict that they had, which was the map book, and how Barry kept forcing this down Iris because this is what the future said. I did really like how they had to fight over that and overcome that conflict, and then just stick together side by side and resolve that conflict. Those were very interesting, and we did also have interesting things being established in this episode as well, such as Barry's map book, which automatically got thrown out of the window, but we did find out some pretty interesting tidbits, such as Iris getting pregnant soon, her winning her first Pulitzer, and things like that. Yet for Iris's character for this entire arc, she has done nothing besides be at Barry's side, which, yes, it might seem like a good thing, and yes, we do see them have these cute and sweet moments in this season, which we didn't really have a lot of before, but this also is something that doesn't work at the same time. For example, when Barry is out there as the Flash, in episode 1, she was out there in the field with the Flash, and we get West Allen scenes with Barry suited up, and that could of course compromise Barry's identity, so those sorts of stuff didn't really make a lot of sense. And as I said, aside from the baby moon stuff, Iris has been very lackluster in terms of what she's given in the storyline. There's nothing that shows in this entire storyline where Iris works towards getting this Pulitzer. Yes, she does have cool moments later on in the storyline, such as her finding out that Ryan Wilder, or imposter Ryan Wilder, is lying. Like, all of those stuff where she uses her journalism skills, they were very, very cool and worked really well. But Iris as a journalist overall has been lacking a lot of in these first 5 episodes, which I really wish we could have seen a lot of, because this was a huge strength in The Flash Season 8, and they just didn't include it, which in my opinion was a big miss. Now, one thing I did really like about this episode is the future seeds it planted and the foreshadowing, which is Barry applying for Director of Central City Police CSI Division. And the reason why I like this so much is because this is a loose end that they didn't really tie up from The Flash Season 1, because this was obviously brought up that Barry would become Director of CCPD CSI Division in The Flash Season 1 when Barry met Gideon for the first time. This was revealed. So I'm really glad that they did mention that Barry will be getting this promotion, in which I know Eric Wallace did mention that him and the writers have been rewatching The Flash Season 1 to see if there are any loose ends that they need to tie a bow on, and since this is the final season, it does make a lot of sense. Now, the concept of a time loop as the first episode was also a huge risk, and it did have its ups and downs, the ups of course being Barry and Iris. That was a very, very big strength. But the downs, there was hardly anything that developed the Red Death storyline forward. Aside from that ending and the introduction to our first rogue, that being Captain Boomerang, which was a pretty cool introduction. And we did have Barry constantly having to stop him due to them looping back consistently. We did have some really cool traits shown by the Flash where he's not been depowered. He's still very confident like he was in the Flash Season 8, which was something I did really like. But a lot of it, due to this time loop, was very wasted in my opinion. Instead, we could have found out a lot more about this new Captain Boomerang and possibly even find out about how these new rogues formed and how Red Death formed this team. Those would have been very interesting to see. Now, the introduction of Red Death at the end definitely included mystery around the characters, such as how is she around, what is she after, is she actually the new negative Speed Force avatar? These sorts of questions did pop up, which for me, I do really like mystery, so I did really like how this worked. But the result of this entire episode, it did not feel like a premiere at all, but more so an interlude episode only consisting of hints of the main storyline. Now, the supporting cast by far being at its worst this season, not because it's changed or anything like that, it's been the same for a few seasons now, but certain things they've done, such as making Chillblaine a series regular and introducing a brand new character, all of that just expanded the cast even more, and it did and will cause issues in the remainder of the season as well. But the supporting cast in general was very, very awful, and this was primarily due to the awful and very uninteresting storylines they have been given, which not only significantly brings down the entire season, but also you can tell this is just to fill in time for a 40-minute episode, all of which were completely awful. The Joe leaving storyline lacks emotion due to this season already being its last. If this was something they did, for example, 2 seasons ago, it would have hit much harder. This is a completely pointless storyline to do in its final season, as of course this applies to this entire cast. Everyone's leaving because after the season we won't be getting any of them anymore because the show is ending. This is why Joe leaving doesn't really hit as hard as it should have. It was just a waste and a pointless storyline because, as I said, once again, this is the final season, so we're having all of these cast members leaving anyways, so why are we having a whole storyline of Joe leaving? Now, Cecile has the second worst storyline this season. Not only does it make no sense at all for her to not just leave with Joe, but also them just pushing forward the idea of Cecile becoming a superhero. It's god awful. It definitely is something that shouldn't have happened. Instead, if they really wanted to keep her, which once again I didn't think was the smart move, she should have just left with Joe. They should have just stuck to her meta lawyer stuff, because these are the types of things where Cecile works. She could have even helped out Iris in The Citizen or something like that. Nothing to do with the superhero stuff. Now, Chester and Allegra is another awful storyline. The idea of them pushing forward this relationship is awful. 2 characters with absolutely no chemistry at all, and is evidently only there because A, they don't know what to do with those characters, and B, it's just to waste time in episodes as well. Now, going into episode 2, despite tonally being a much better episode than the first, this of course just including tone, the episode overall was even worse to awful compared to episode 1. This episode does not only the biggest mistake in the entire Arrowverse, but took a huge risk in the storyline, and it did definitely affect the overall storyline significantly, that being the introduction of a new character, making the episode completely being centered around her, so pretty much 90% filler and 10% of the main storyline in its final season, and this was just an awful decision. In this episode, we got introduced to Keon, which aside from her being very innocent, very sweet, and just very cute, she does get very annoying when using these plant and nature analogies, which I guess, yes, it's to hint to her abilities coming in, but this character should not have been a thing. Worst of all, due to them having to develop this brand new character, the episode had to be completely centered around her, which was a big mistake, and it definitely lacked progressing the story. They have done the biggest mistake in the entire Arrowverse, that being killing off Caitlyn, an OG Team Flash member, off screen, but also no one in Team Flash, worst of all Barry included, seemed to care at all. Like, the only piece of dialogue they had was Chillblaine said Caitlyn's dead, and they're just like, wait, what? And they just moved on. We didn't even get something with Barry, who's been a very, very close friend of Caitlyn's for 9 years, crying. We could have had Barry crying over this or something like that at least. We could have even had a funeral for Caitlyn, but we didn't get anything. Nothing emotional at all. And this was very, very disrespectful to Caitlyn's character, and for me, this was even worse than what Arrow did with killing off Laurel. This was way worse in so many levels. Now, this episode did somewhat push the storyline forward, with like 10% of it being focused on the main storyline, maybe even less, maybe like 5% of it, to be honest. And that is with the introduction of a new rogue, the Fiddler 2.0, and the Red Death ending. And I did like how they tied Pied Piper into all of this as well. It was a pretty cool addition, but once again lacks explanation of how these rogues formed. And due to 90% of this episode being focused on this new character Keone, this episode was missing something, that of course including more of our main character, or even something with Iris and her journalist stuff, and perhaps more with Red Death and the rogues, further helping to develop this storyline. Having Hartley Rathaway there was a cool addition, but this wasn't enough to save the episode or anything like that. Still, nothing really happens in this episode aside from Red Death being free, in which Eric Wallace kept on saying we have no time to do X, Y, and Z, in which, in my opinion, if you focus on pointless stuff like this and completely waste an episode, obviously you're not going to have time. And the main reason for me why this storyline suffered so much, aside from just it being a mid storyline overall, was all that fault of this episode, where this episode could have been very, very crucial, but instead they just completely wasted it, and as a result the following episodes did have to suffer from this. Now, this is when things slowly start to pick up, and this being episode 3, nothing much really happens until like 35 minutes into the episode, but we have more of the rogues. We get introduced to another rogue, Murmur, and we have more of these rogues stealing more pieces of tech. I did really like how Barry figures out the plan, which was the rogues are trying to create a cosmic treadmill. This, of course, does push the storyline forward as we find out what the rogues are trying to do exactly for Red Death, what Red Death is exactly trying to do. Also, it does add mystery in regards to why Red Death is trying to use a cosmic treadmill, but also it does raise the stakes, because obviously time travel does have big consequences, and the fact that, you know, there is a big threat that's going to supposedly do something to time travel, it was making it much more interesting. We did, of course, have Barry recruiting his own rogues, and it was very funny that we had like Goldface being an addition, we had Jacob Birch being an addition, and we had like a lot of funny moments. In these sorts of situations, this is when like these more cheesier and more comedic types of scenes really works. But this episode did have stakes. I did really like the plan of like the heist and everything like that. Chillblaine betraying the team was a really cool twist, and it was something very, very interesting they've done with his character, but unfortunately it doesn't last for long, which we will talk about in a bit. But this episode did finally introduce Red Death to Team Flash, and in my opinion, in this episode they should have done something with Red Death where we get to see the threat of this villain. They could have done so much more to make this villain so much more threatening. For example, when Red Death attacked the Rogues and Team Flash, Red Death had no reason to leave any of the good rogues alive, and for me they could have done so much better with Red Death killing these good rogues, which not only highlights the threat of this villain, shows how menacing this villain also is, but also it would have been a much more badass introduction, because she really had no reason to leave any of them alive. But also she could have had a fight scene between the Flash and the Red Death. We could have had the very first fight between the Flash and Red Death in this episode, in which this whole storyline, it lacked a lot of action with the main character, which was another negative that this storyline did have. Yes, of course, we did have this incredible fight scene at the end of the graphic novel, but other than that, we had nothing in terms of Flash action, and this was a perfect opportunity to include a Flash versus the Red Death. This could have been the very first fight they've had, and with them introducing this really cool ability of Red Death, which was to steal a speedster's speed, like Barry was completely out of his speed when Red Death attacked him. This could have been something really, really cool, and this could have been where we could have had Red Death performing like a zoom, for example, where she like beats the Flash up, drags him across the city, or just something like that, just to raise the stakes and just make this villain much more threatening and make her actually live up to her name, the Red Death. But once again, we had a lot more mystery being established, such as the original Batwoman, Ryan Wilder, supposedly going missing when she's out patrolling the city. We obviously have a brand new speedster in like a bat suit, so this obviously brought in the question, is this actually the original Batwoman, or is this going to be someone else? So all of this, it did make it very, very intriguing, and obviously with the cliffhanger of last season, it did obviously bring in the possibility that Red Death could have been the negative Speed Force avatar as well, and all of this established really good mystery. And obviously at the end of the episode, we did get the reveal that it was Ryan Wilder, but once again, we didn't really know if it was the original Ryan Wilder, or is this actually going to be like another version of her. But overall, this episode, it did have some really like funny, fun moments between the good Rose and Barry, but also it did get serious when it needed to, and this was something I did really like. However, it did also have some very, very cringy and just cheesy scenes, which once again did bring down the episode as well. Episode 4 was obviously when things started to pick up, and this had to happen because this was the second last episode of the graphic novel, but still had a lot of problems. The worst being, we had a lot of over the top acting from Red Death. We had a lot of very, very cheesy and just very cringy scenes, which once again, it did bring down the episode a lot. We did have the return of a former rogue from season 1, which was pretty cool, that of course being Rainbow Raider, the original one, but he didn't really have a need to be there in my opinion. Like, he didn't really do anything special besides whammy Barry once, and that is about it. But this was when we had the proper interactions between the Flash and the Red Death. We had this thing established where Barry's trying to like see the good in the villains, and it seemed like Red Death really knew who the Flash was. But yeah, we had some cool scenes such as Barry trying to get through to Red Death, saying it's all the negative Speed Force corrupting you, it's making you like bring in all of your negative emotions and things like that. I did really like those interactions between the Flash and Red Death, and of course we did get the reveal that Red Death wasn't actually the negative Speed Force avatar, so this was a pretty cool twist. But we just found out that Red Death was just an artificial speedster, so she really has no connection to the Speed Force. But this of course did bring in big problems as well. So we did of course have imposter Ryan Wilder pretty much being an imposter as Ryan Wilder, and she asks Iris for help because in her timeline, Iris and Ryan Wilder were best friends, but in this timeline they haven't really properly met, but she uses it as an advantage because Ryan Wilder is missing. But yeah, we have this interaction between Iris and Ryan Wilder, and I did really like how Iris uses her like journalist slash kind of detective like side to her to find out that this Ryan Wilder is not the real Ryan Wilder. This is this new speedster right in front of her. I did really like how Iris manages to solve all of that, but this is when every single problem starts to arise. The first one being Iris pulls up the negative velocity gun, or the velocity zero gun, whatever it's called, which was a gun she received in Armageddon, an alternate timeline, and there was no explanation for her having this gun in this timeline, and that made absolutely no sense. But just as this wasn't enough, we have even more problems that start to arise. The first one being, we find out that Red Death is from an alternate timeline. Now, in this timeline, Red Death does pretty much mention that she's been betrayed by the Flash, and in her timeline that the Flash is evil, in which that's obviously her believing that the Flash is evil, and she believes that she is the good guy. She's trying to like eliminate every single threat possible and just various things like that. She studied the Flash, and that's how she created her own artificial speed force and became a speedster. All of that seems good. Only one thing, that being the concept of an alternate timeline never existed on the show. Now, the way they explained alternate timelines in the show was that a speedster had to create this alternate timeline. We have our main timeline, and a speedster has to create this alternate timeline for there to be an alternate timeline, aka Flashpoint or Reverse Flashpoint, or season 1 episode 15 where Barry pretty much changed the timeline. Those are pretty much alternate timelines. So there needs to have been a speedster that created this alternate timeline. However, Red Death is not Reverse Flashpoint Batwoman. She is from a completely different timeline. So how is this possible? That alone was a big plot hole, and Eric Wallace did definitely mix up like the concept of like an alternate timeline. He did try and bring in like a more multiversal feel to it. However, the fact that this concept wasn't explained, it made no sense. Now, worst of all was how Red Death ended up in our timeline, and she mentions that she had no connection to the Speed Force, so the Speed Force pretty much threw her into the main timeline. If you really think about it, the Speed Force, created by Barry and Iris in The Flash Season 7, drops off a supervillain randomly into their timeline. How does that work? She doesn't even tell Barry that there's a new speedster around. How does that even make sense? Why doesn't she just leave her back in her alternate timeline? Why does she have to end up bringing Red Death into our timeline, and the Speed Force doesn't inform Barry about this? Like, that made no sense at all. And having all of this sandwiched together, realizing that Red Death never had an established rivalry with our version of the Flash, made this even worse in my opinion. But of course, Red Death then starts to attack Iris, and then she brings Iris to the warehouse to obviously threaten Barry to use the cosmic treadmill, which then Chillblaine prevents Red Death's plan by pretty much destroying the cosmic treadmill. Red Death is defeated temporarily, and then the good rogues come in, they save the Flash, but leave Chillblaine there to die. Which again, it doesn't make sense that they just left someone there to die, which yes, I'm happy that they acknowledged that and that we had that conflict in the episode, which was something I did really like. But we had a lot of very cheesy and just very over the top acting with Red Death's character. Now, in terms of Red Death was a very weak villain and a very weak point in this season. Not only due to her having no established rivalry with our version of the Flash until the very last episode, which we are going to talk about in just a second, but everything was saved for last minute. The final battle between the Flash and Red Death, all of those sorts of stuff left for last minute. There was nothing really threatening with the villain. She doesn't live up to her name, the Red Death. We don't even see her like killing anyone, which, as I said, episode 3 was the perfect time to really highlight this threat of the villain. This felt a lot like Godspeed in the sense that, you know, she's an artificial speedster stuck in the timeline. We did have those sentients pretty much being like Godspeed clones. It felt very repetitive in that sense. And once again, we had a lot of over-the-top acting and very just cringe and cheesy dialogue with the character. Made her feel more like a cartoon/comic book character. But I'm going to say this is not Javicia Leslie's fault at all. Javicia Leslie is just an actress. She's just received the script. She's told to do whatever the director says pretty much. This is not her fault at all. And for those who watch Batwoman, and that includes me, I've watched Batwoman as well. In Batwoman, Javicia Leslie is very good. Over here, she was very over the top, and she had to read out those cringe dialogues and just very cheesy lines. This is not her fault at all. This is all the writers and the directors, in my opinion. Now, episode 5 for me, in my opinion, was a huge success. This episode I really loved. I loved the big final battle we had between the Flash and the Red Death. It was definitely the best Flash fight scene we've had in terms of like a speedster versus a speedster. In my opinion, I thought all of the visual effects and everything like that, like all those cool lightning throws, the Speed Force constructs, all of that I thought was really sick. I did really like Red Death's plan B, which was to pretty much take over the Flash's city, since she wasn't able to go back home, and so she's just going to take revenge against the Flash by going after his city. All of that I love. Like, this was Red Death where she had nothing left to lose, and in my opinion, this is where she could have gone all out and actually lives up to her name. the Red Death. But regardless, we did still have some really cool things happening with Red Death's character. I did really like how we had to establish that, she's using psychic energy from someone, so she's getting a neural boost from a psychic source, and we get the twist that she's been working with Gorilla Grodd to escalate this plan B. I thought that was really cool. All of the character interactions I thought was really, really good. For example, the no power talk between Keon and Iris, where they feel like they're the odd ones out and they're no help because of her powers, but Iris says you just have to find your place in the team and things like that. Those sorts of talks I did really love. I absolutely loved the interaction between Barry and Joe as well, where towards the climax of the episode, Barry is all alone. He's lost all of the good rogues, they left because they believe that they've lost. Barry is feeling useless. Joe is feeling useless. We did have this incredible discussion where Joe talks about Barry's gift being bringing out the good in people, but then Barry reverses it back, saying if it weren't for you, all of these heroes wouldn't be raised the way they are to Joe, and that Joe's superpower is inspiring people. Absolutely loved all of that. And also I did really love the discussion between Grodd and Barry, where Barry pep talks Grodd. He's like, what if Red Death betrays you? You don't know any of that. There's always another way. You could be a hero like you were before. I need your help to save the world. All of that was really cool. Obviously Red Death's plan goes south, it goes down, doesn't work out, and that final battle between the Flash and the Red Death, all of it was really, really cool. Aside from a lot of cheesy and cringy acting once again from Red Death, and the dialogue really didn't help, but all of it was really cool. Apart from, there were a couple of issues still. A being, if you really think about it, the rogues are still around. They haven't fully been wrapped up yet. Red Death's been defeated, but the rogues are still around. And B, Batwoman's return. Now, despite her having some absolutely badass cool entrance, having this final battle between Red Death and Batwoman doesn't really explain, or we don't even get the explanation of what happened to Batwoman, why she's been away for so long, and how she just randomly ended up in Central City helping the Flash out. That didn't really make any sense, and we didn't really get an explanation for it, in which I wished we could. But then the episode wraps up with, of course, Joe's goodbye party, which once again, as I said towards the start of the review, lacked emotion because this is the final season and this is going to be the last time we're seeing all of the cast together anyways. So this storyline with Joe leaving is quite pointless. But then we obviously have the reveal that Iris is pregnant, which it was a pretty cool way to end the storyline, I guess. So yeah, overall, despite some pretty good moments each of the episode had, overall as a storyline, this was hands down one of the weakest storylines. A lot has been wasted and could have been used to do better, and including a lackluster villain barely doing anything until the last episode, all of which ends up forming a very, very weak and very disappointing start to the season in my opinion. So overall, the first 5 episodes of The Flash Season 9, titled Rogue War and the Red Death arc, it is one of the worst storylines of The Flash in my opinion. But yeah guys, this is pretty much it in terms of my first 5 episode review for The Flash Season 9. So if you guys went on to enjoy the video, please give a like and subscribe. Be sure to let me know in the comment section down below what you guys thought about this storyline as a whole. I'm interested to see all of your thoughts towards all of this as well. And yeah, I will see you guys in my next video.